Hello, everyone. This is Rebecca Sive, a guest with Sophie and Kelly on the Voter In segment of Two Broads. And welcome to this show. We're really excited about doing this. We're hoping that you'll find it interesting and valuable and inspirational. And most important, we're looking forward to sharing what we know and working together to make this dream of voting in our next woman president come true. So let your friends know, welcome, and let's get going. Thanks.
Are you listening?
Hey everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics, and we are in our 6th episode in our series called Vote Her In. I'm here with our partner on this project, Rebecca Sive. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, it's good to be here.
Yeah, so it seems like the presidential primary race is really heating up, so we'll have a lot to talk about in coming weeks about the women who are running. But we are going to look this week at the recent Chicago mayoral election to look a little bit about women running for executive office at the city level, but in a major city like Chicago, and what some lessons are that we've learned from that. So maybe we could just start with kind of setting the scene, what happened in the recent Chicago race. So the runoff in the Chicago mayoral was earlier this month in early April. And in the runoff, we actually had two African-American women against each other in the runoff, Toni Preckwinkle and the eventual winner, Lori Lightfoot. Do you want to set the stage a little bit beyond that about sort of what this race looked like?
Yeah, it's really great for us to be able to talk about this because, as you said, the presidential is really heating up, and as that competition, gets more substantive and people really are thinking about how they're going to differentiate themselves, I think this is a useful sort of case to look at. One thing, for starters, is to just declare the victory of the history, which is that there were 4 women of color who ran in the primary in Chicago. We've never had anything like that before. I don't think there's been anything like that in any other major city. And as you pointed out, 2 women were the top vote getters in the primary and then ran against each other. I think in terms of the kind of lessons learned, they fall in a couple of different categories. And I thought we might sort of review those. And the first is sort of the strategic approach they took. The second is some tactical issues that I think are important. And then there's the matter of how they explored the issues of women's leadership and women's issues. Mm-hmm. So maybe we want to start by talking about the strategic matter.
Yeah, and I think, one of the for people who don't know Chicago politics as well as the two of us do, this was a relatively rare situation in Chicago that there was an open election for mayor. Right. We tend to have mayors who stick around for a very long time. And so I think it was only the 4th time in the past 100 years that there wasn't an incumbent running for mayor. And I think that sort of really helps us think about what was going on. And one of the important pieces of strategy in this that Lori Lightfoot announced while we thought that Rahm Emanuel would still be running. So announced before it was clear that it was an open election, unlike a lot of people that eventually got into the race.
Yeah, and I think, there's a couple of different ways of looking at it. And obviously people who felt, strongly about one candidate or another had a point of view on that. In some cases, and I don't necessarily think this was true in Lori's case, although certainly she was a long shot, people decide, and we've talked about this a little bit in the past, they decide to run for an office to sort of get themselves out there, to get some name recognition, to develop a policy platform and see what works. And sort of reading the tea leaves, it may be that that's what Lori was doing, and there's never any reason to discount a person doing that. So while it wasn't clear to the rest of us, that Rahm Emanuel wasn't going to choose to run again, for those who wanted to put themselves out there, it was a good thing to do. And by contrast, Tony Preckwinkle, who ultimately became the person who also won the primary, didn't choose to seek the nomination until after it was clear that Rahm Emanuel was leaving for the mayorship for, I don't know, some kind of probably greener pastures. A lot of people criticize her for that. On the other hand, there's also a fair assessment that every candidate makes about, well, can I do this? Can I raise the money that's needed? What is the competition really going to look like? So I think that in terms of strategy, they were doing something similar to some of these current presidential candidates. Mm-hmm. At least Warren and Klobuchar, for instance, could have run in the same primary that, Hillary Clinton ran in 2012, but they chose not to.
Yeah. Do you think that, in your experience looking at campaigns, do you think that this is something that women are more likely to do, women need to do a little more? Do we think, looking at the presidential race, there are clearly a lot of people running who are not going to end up the nominee, given how many people are running. Is it good for the women, especially, to be putting their name out there like that, to be thought of for various positions on cabinet and things like that for future races?
I think you're exactly right. I think what's shown is that, and certainly all of this, storm of discussion over the last week or so about the unequal media coverage of the women candidates as compared to the male candidates, makes the point that, you really need to be out there because you may not get as much of a chance to tell your story as your male competition does. So I think in most cases it does behoove women to, get out there early, say what they want to do, as I said before, develop the name recognition. And I think if you look at some other races around the country, in the past, you've seen women who are seeking high office do that. Of course, in other cases, they work their way up the ladder and were able to prevail in the first instance. But yes, I think we have to, in the face of this, I think we have to think about encouraging the women we know. And I would just add one other thing to this, which also relates to strategy, which is, if you look at the contrast between what's happening with Elizabeth Warren right now and some of the, male candidates, I mean, she is so heavy on issuing clear policy statements and position papers, whereas some of the men who are ahead of her in the, the race are not. And again, I think it's a kind of attempt, not only because she believes in these issues and wants to get them out there, but an attempt to sort of keep her name in front of people, make it clear to people that she really is a viable candidate.
So are there other pieces to the strategies that we saw in the Chicago race that we think are useful to think about?
Well, when I was thinking about it, I kind of felt that the biggest strategic piece probably for listeners of this podcast was the lack of focus, so to speak, particularly on women's, what I would call women's issues. And of course, every issue is a woman's issue, but women predominate among those who are lowest paid, among the poorest households, certainly in Chicago and other big cities. There are issues related to reproductive health that municipalities touch on through their public health services. Certainly in the economic development arena, that's important because women tend to have, jobs that are part-time and all of that. So I kind of feel, and I don't know the answer to this, but there's an open question here in terms of strategy as to whether it behooves a candidate to talk more about, so to speak, classic women's issues. And of course, in the presidential, Kirsten Gillibrand is doing that, but we didn't see either Lori Lightfoot or Tony Preckwinkle do that. And whereas they focused heavily on the same issues that the male candidates focused on, on, issues of crime and education and other things. So I kind of feel that the jury's out on that, because if you also look at the presidential, for instance, Amy Klobuchar isn't talking a lot about, quote, women's issues, nor is Kamala Harris. So maybe they know something we don't know. But on the other hand, the fact of the matter is that it's women, and particularly women of color, who are the backbone of the Democratic Party. So presumably they have a significant interest in these issues and would want to hear from the candidates.
Yeah, and, I wonder if maybe we'll talk more about sort of what happened with Hillary's campaign, good and bad, but I always kind of wondered if maybe if she had talked more about women's issues, had leaned more into being a woman and being the first woman, and,
Right.
if that would have actually helped sort of excite the base who would be out there knocking doors and campaigning for her. And, it apparently wasn't needed in the Chicago election, although maybe, you could argue that some of these things we care more about nationally than locally. But, I do think in a presidential race that it could be that actually leaning into those things like Kirsten Gillibrand is doing might be really useful.
Well, the other thing about it is you don't know in terms of a municipal race. And in large cities, this is really an issue, because the cities in many cases are, the funnels for federal monies, and the mayors of these cities have a disproportionate capacity to influence presidential action. I mean, we don't know what would have happened, say, had either candidate, but certainly Toni Preckwinkle, having been in office for so many years prior to this run, had she sat down and talked about, well, when I worked on affordable housing, this is what it meant for the women in my ward. Or when I worked on the healthcare system for Cook County, which serves millions of people, this is what it meant for the women of Cook County. So I'm not sure we know, and I think that this test case with Gillibrand, at least at the moment, as compared to the other women candidates, is really important. And it's particularly important in light of the fact that, women voters will make the difference, certainly in key states that were won by President Trump the last time around. So I think it's a kind of an interesting question. I don't know whether it would have made the winning difference for Toni Preckwinkle, but it is true that more women voted than men. And as I said, the people who benefit most from those public services are women-headed families.
Do you think that not just these women running for mayor, but these women running for mayor and other women who have run, including Hillary, do you think that part of the reason they don't lean into those issues is because they don't want to turn off male voters? Or do you think that, that just isn't the thing that is most important to them?
Well, the conventional wisdom on this, I think, says that, people vote party more than they vote gender. At least, and so the significance of that is, in answer to your question, at least in part, is that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have, stated positions on issues that, affect everybody. So whether it's education or crime or whatever. So I think the answer to that question may be the case that the candidates feel they have to, run the whole board, so to speak. It's also true, and I think that we should touch on this, that in most of these campaigns still, the majority of the executive level decision makers in terms of the campaigns are men. And, whether this is a factor when you've got mostly men sitting at a table deciding, well, what's our candidate going to talk about, or what speech is she going to give, or what organization is she going to visit? And, I would just say on that point that I know this from personal experience, how hard I and others who've been in a similar situation have had to fight and say, no, let's go to this women's organization. You're going to be able to talk about issues that really matter, and this will make a difference. The other thing related to it is the matter of donors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So who are those donors, and how much say they have, particularly the big donors, in influencing a candidate, where she spends her time, what meetings she goes to, what fundraisers she actually attends, versus sending a surrogate. And again, there's just lots of data on the fact that at least until very recently, the major donors to these campaigns have been men. That was true in this mayoral. Who knows what what difference it might have made? I don't know, but it's interesting to think about and important to think about, whether it would have mattered had, for instance, leading women executives made their voices heard and opened their checkbooks in a bigger way than they did.
Yeah, I think, in some ways, this is really interesting in a mayoral race, like in Chicago, where they can just raise as much money from individuals as they possibly want to. And there were some really, really big checks being written in the final month or so of that race. In the presidential race, where individuals are somewhat limited in their ability to make their own donations, and part of it is, bundling and PACs and things. I wonder, it could be that women are increasingly being the ones who are running the PACs and doing the bundling, and that women will start to have more of an influence sort of at the table.
Well, it's true that you're right that there is increasing influence. More women gave significant checks in the 2012 campaign, which happened to be for Hillary Clinton, than had ever happened before. Women are giving right now in big numbers. But the issue there is because, as you mentioned, there are federal limits on what individuals can do. The real issue there is people who are bundlers, right? Mm-hmm. People who put together lots of different people's checks and therefore have an outsized influence on a candidate. And, Elizabeth Warren, at least currently, is the only one to have said she's not going to have big donor events and spend that time with them. So it's to be seen whether those bundler people have a significant measure of them are women or not. I think it's too early to tell, but again, there's absolutely no discounting the impact those people have, and it really is an affirmative choice on the part of the person looking at it positively. I know there are some listeners who may think this is a bad thing, but there's just no discounting the fact of the influence that those people have.
When we're talking about the Chicago race and some of these huge checks that I was talking about, I get the daily Politico email about Illinois politics. And some of these amounts were just mind blowing to me.
Right.
What does that difference look like between male donors and female donors?
Well, just by way of example, and just the caveat that I haven't seen the last reports, but at one point about a week out in the Chicago mayoral, there were men, I can think of one who had, given $400,000, and a couple of women, by contrast, who had given $100 each, more or less $100. So, I don't know how people feel about those kinds of gifts in the first place, but it does demonstrate that the major male donors are looking at this differently, at least so far, than the major women have. And I guess I would stress this aspect of things only because of the fact that these people stand out and then have the capacity to bring their own institutions, into this mix. And in that context, I think there's another important strategic piece that we might just want to touch on, which is the, institutional endorsers, right? The heads of organizations, the people who hold office, and what they say and when they say it, right? So we're sort of now at the point where we can look at the Chicago mayoral and we can see that, the biggest institutional endorsers, again, were men who are heads of labor unions, for instance, on the Preckwinkle side, and heads of major businesses on the Lightfoot side. Now, that's may or may not hold in the presidential, but it seems to me that if women were to step up in that context too, right? Maybe they have to work their way up to be the head of a PAC or the head of a union or whatever it is. Obviously, they do. But what are the names you see when you look at X person's campaign or X woman's campaign, and as a feminist, right? Mm-hmm. What do you think about that? Well, gee, she really sought out those women as endorsers. And I like that because I care about the issues that institution is focused on.
Yeah.
And since you win by, one vote or maybe a few more in some of these key states, right, it's going to matter. I also wanted to just mention here in terms of the strategic piece, not so much on the tactical, but the matter that both of these women who ran in Chicago, Lori Lightfoot and Toni Preckwinkle, like the women who are running for president in the Democratic Party at the moment, are extremely well educated, have years and years of experience that's pertinent to the position they are seeking. And without naming names, although we could, that's not true, for instance, of all of the male candidates in the presidential.
Or all of the male candidates in the mayoral race.
Exactly. So, this is the ongoing truth that we know from studying women who run for office and how hard they work to learn the material and feel that they're qualified. And then they start on a rung of the ladder that's usually fairly low and work their way up. And it held true here. And at the moment, it's holding true in the presidential. And so I kind of think one of the questions going forward, which I haven't yet seen explored, and maybe we'll see more of it as these campaigns unfold, is whether that, actually matters, right? Or whether people are voting on how they feel about somebody or the values of someone, as Mayor Pete has said, versus I actually have experience in this job, and I actually have policy positions based on this job, and I actually have an education that relates to this job, and therefore I'm the most qualified.
It seems like we could be at a point in American politics where experience actually hurts you, that people are looking for just something different, and that seems to be playing out at all sorts of different levels, but it played out in this mayoral race as well.
Absolutely.
Or at least perceived sort of outsider status.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. That the perception was that because Lori Lightfoot had never held elected office, she therefore could run as an outsider and did do that, whereas Toni Preckwinkle has held office for, over a quarter of a century. And people said they wanted change. And so there they had a candidate who said, I'm change, even though she had considerable government experience working for two prior mayors. Mm-hmm. So I think it's, it may be that that's sufficient for voters, the notion that someone says change, or maybe they just feel, gee whiz, I'm, sick and tired of who's been here, and I don't particularly like them in particular. But it's hard to say, but I would sort of point out that because people are, including women candidates, kind of seeking to find any edge they can. So, for instance, Lori ran as a, quote, outsider and change agent, although she'd spent a lot of time at City Hall. They have to do it because they have to be intense about winning and be willing to say things that, I'm not saying they're not true, but have nuance to them, let's put it that way. And right. That kind of intensity, or that willingness, I guess, to claim a point of view or a position, then can evolve, as it did here, or devolve into a fair amount of nastiness as people fight about that. And I think that's the other thing that perhaps as we look ahead to the presidential, it will be interesting to see whether the women candidates, for instance, get as picky as the two mayoral candidates did. Mm-hmm. People were hoping for something else. We didn't see it. But whether that's just the nature of the tactical approach one has to take.
Yeah, so, I think we ideally would just like to see happier campaigning in general, right. Less negative campaigning in general. But I think a lot of people have this idea that, if women are campaigning, they might be less likely to attack, less likely to be negative. And certainly, as you're saying, what we saw in Chicago was not the case.
Right, right. So that's kind of one of those big open questions that's going to be fun for us to look at and important to consider. I would just add one other as a sort of lesson from Chicago, and that is to go back to where we started, which is two women of color ran for mayor of the third largest city. So the question there, which is really a positive one, is have we really now broken down some barriers, and can women of other, so to speak, minority status or minority backgrounds have the opportunity to run too? I mean, obviously Kamala Harris is running, Tulsi Gabbard is running, but will there just be now a much kind of more open and, I would say, generous view of who can run for office, not only women, but women of particular backgrounds? So, maybe we'll just keep breaking down these barriers, and notwithstanding all these other potentially negative experiences, have a positive one in relation to that.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the things people loved from outside Chicago when they woke up to the news that, not just a woman of color was going to be running Chicago, but an openly gay woman of color was going to be running the third largest city in the country. And that, you can sort of break down all sorts of barriers at once if you have the right candidate and the right campaign.
And perhaps there's one other big lesson related to what you just said, which is this issue of identity, so to speak, that it doesn't necessarily correspond to your views on the issues, right? Just because you're, say, a lesbian doesn't mean you're a progressive, but it is important to voters, and voters are willing to go further than they have in the past. And does that then provide an opening for the person who's elected to put forth new policies, right, that couldn't have been imagined before? Because, gee whiz, a lesbian of color carried every single ward in Chicago. What does that mean for what else she could do? We don't know that. And it's actually pretty significant, because people had to take at least some people, had to have more of an open mind than they've had in the past.
Yeah, and it's probably worth noting for people not in Chicago that although Chicago is obviously a heavily Democratic city, it's not necessarily the most progressive type of Democratic politics always, although that's certainly shifting.
That's, of course, right. I guess what I would say is that in that context, does it open the door to new policy positions, right? I mean, I think that when we're looking at the presidential candidates and evaluating them, the men as well as the women, it'll be interesting to see whether it does or it doesn't, whether identity, as an individual matter, really makes a difference on what kind of positions, the candidates put forth and campaign on. And if it doesn't really matter, it really is a matter of individual, who an individual is. How do we then take that into account, or don't we, right? Kind of an abstruse question, but I think an important one for people who make the assumption, this is something we talked about before, that, you don't have to be a progressive to be a woman leader, right? I mean, that would be one way of looking at it. So I guess my takeaway on Chicago is, number one, all the positive, which we've discussed about, this history-making event. And then secondly, looking closely at a woman who has stated she's an agent of change and comes from a different perspective, and see how much that enables her to perhaps put forth a position on important matters that she hasn't, or that other candidates have not. So I think we'll see with the presidential candidates how that comes out.
All right. Excellent. And we will be back in 2 weeks to continue our series, Vote Her In. And if you haven't listened to the previous episodes, you can find them all on our website. There'll be a link from this episode. So I think this is exciting, and we're definitely getting into the heat of the season on presidential politics. So it will continue to be a really important discussion.
And I think what we're going to do, which I have to say, Kelly, I neglected to do last week, is we're going to get really nerdy and start giving you all links to read, right?
Yes.
And think about that as a positive, because we certainly don't have all the answers. But the more we all get to look at this and think, the better off we're going to be. So look for that as well.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, Rebecca, thank you again. And next time we talk, we'll have Sophie back from vacation, and
Wonderful.
We will continue to dive into this issue.
Take care, Kelly, and thanks.
The Vote Her In segment is a collaboration of Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. Our theme song is called Are You Listening, off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.